Policy and National Security Programs here at the New America Foundation. I want to thank all of you for joining us on a morning program, which we rarely have. I also want to say hello to those people watching online. There are people all around the world with us today through our blogs, The American Strategist and the New America Foundation sites, and then my own blog, The Washington Note. I've retitled today's program, instead of Public Diplomacy 2.0, our friend Helena Cobbin said, you know, that's so old-fashioned, so I've retitled it Facebook Twitter Diplomacy. And we may laugh about it, but one of the interesting things when you go around the world, and I've just recently been in Europe, I was in Asia recently, are the number of people that are, where there's a new network architecturally linking people in real-time communications all the time. And when you sort of look at how businesses and Google and Facebook and Twitter, and you know, mine is buzzing all the time here on my little iPhone, you figure there's got to be some way that we can make the world really a better place by doing this. And my friend James Glassman, who many of you know as the recently appointed, confirmed Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, has been thinking through ways in which we can apply technology and this social networking, these social networking possibilities to the world of diplomacy, and public diplomacy in particular. Jim has a very long bio, and I'm going to mention just a couple of elements of it. We know he's been a long-time participant in publishing in Washington, policy publishing. He was president of the Atlantic Monthly. He was vice president of U.S. News and World Report, publisher of the New Republic. He became an executive and co-editor of the Washingtonian magazine long ago. He most recently, for the American Enterprise Institute, was the editor-in-chief, I believe, of The American. Which was a very interesting magazine. And as long as I've known Jim, and I've had the pleasure of knowing him since about 1995, he and I have been friends, but we have wrestled with each other over ideas and policy and politics, and I have found him to be an outstanding partner with me in sort of thinking through questions and not getting lost in the laziness of ideological predispositions and things. I think that what Jim did recently, too, for a program here at the New America Foundation a few months ago, 6 months, I'm no good at linear time. July, yeah, so he's not recently appointed. He just looks young and fresh. He gave a talk that really did have some impact in the way in which people think about public diplomacy, and I don't want to cast this in terms of his predecessor, Karen Hughes. But a lot of people, when they saw this post of the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Karen Hughes and asked themselves, what are you doing? Most people sort of looked at that role as one where their job was to go out and sell America, to make foreigners love America, to do something with our, you know, dismally low favorability ratings abroad. And Jim said, that's not my job at all. My job, as he sees it, if I'm quoting him correctly, was to sort of look at ways in which you could encourage youth and others abroad, when they get engaged, they have grievances, they have protests, to choose paths other than violence. And I thought, wow, that's a fascinating way to frame it. We had a program that I did with Steve Cole here of the New America Foundation, and of course the New Yorker magazine, and Peter Bergen and others. And I started out my comments with this question of how can you use the various tools we have to deal with Islamic extremism and try and find choices other than violence. So I am thrilled that Jim Glassman is here today to talk to us about Facebook Twitter diplomacy, or public diplomacy 2.0, as he puts it. I don't think the State Department would let him get away with my title, but that's what we're really talking about. So without further ado, please welcome James Glassman.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Well, I like your title. And in fact, the State Department doesn't even know what I'm going to say today, so it's not a question of them letting me say this. It's just maybe I'm still mired in old speak. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, New America, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you today about Public Diplomacy 2.0. I'll begin in a surprising place, Colombia. For more than 40 years, Colombia had been in a state of siege from violent extremists of both the left and the right. But now it is winning. Since 2002, Colombia has reduced terrorist attacks by more than 3/4. There are several reasons. Military and intelligence operations are working. So is an ambitious program to demobilize extremists and then reintegrate them into society. But just as important, the environment that forms the backdrop for terrorism has changed. Once frozen in fear and apathy, Colombians today are fed up with the wanton violence, and they are standing up. A powerful counter-movement has emerged that has demoralized the remaining terrorist group, the FARC. The origins of this new force were not in government or in civil society organizations that were then existing. Instead, a young, unemployed computer technician named Oscar Morales spontaneously started a Facebook group that grew rapidly to more than 400,000 members. The group, called 1 Million Voices Against the FARC, put 12 million people into the streets of Bogota and 190 other cities around the world in one day, just 2 months after the Facebook group was set up. I'll get back to Colombia, but first a little bit of background. Shortly after I was sworn in, I came here to New America, as Steve said, to lay out our strategy for public diplomacy. It included a shift in focus and emphasis toward the war of ideas. Much of our public diplomacy effort had been devoted to building a positive image of the United States, mainly through long-term programs like educational and cultural exchanges and efforts to tell America's story. And that's still where we spend most of our money. But there's more to public diplomacy. In April 2006, the President designated the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs as the government-wide lead in strategic communications, or the war of ideas. I provide leadership and coordination for my colleagues at the Defense Department, the intelligence community, and beyond. In the war of ideas, our core task in 2008 is to create an environment hostile to violent extremism, and we do that in two ways: by undermining extremist ideologies and by encouraging young people to follow productive paths that lead away from terrorism, as Steve just said. The Colombian experience is relevant to both these tracks. It also reminds us that there is nihilistic violence in the world that is built on ideologies that have nothing at all to do with Islam or any other religion. The intellectual historian Paul Berman puts the case very well in his important book, Terror and Liberalism. Camus noticed a modern impulse to rebel, writes Paul Berman, which had come out of the French Revolution in the 19th century and had very quickly, in the name of an ideal, mutated into a cult of death. And the ideal was always the same, though each movement gave it a different name. It was not skepticism and doubt. It was the ideal of submission. It was submission to the kind of authority that liberal civilization had slowly undermined and which the new movements wished to reestablish on a novel basis. It was the ideal of the one instead of the many, the ideal of something godlike, the total state, the total doctrine, the total movement. And that's Paul Berman. That describes the FARC, which emerged from the Colombian Communist Party in 1964. It also describes Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It describes the Iran of the Ayatollahs and other threats that we face in the 21st century. Beyond ideology, what most violent extremists around the world have in common is that their leaders hijack impressionable young people to carry out their crimes of terrorism. These young people are exceptionally vulnerable. A terrorist leader fills the hole in the heart of a young person searching for identity with what is sometimes seen as the most alluring game in town, linking adventure with the doctrine of hatred, fantasy, greed, and hysteria. The reality, as young people who join Al-Qaeda and the FARC soon learn, is quite different. In Saudi Arabia, a week and a half ago, I met a young man who was severely disfigured with burns when the fuel truck that he was driving for Al-Qaeda in Iraq was blown up by his supposed comrades by remote control. He was driving a guided missile and did not know it. Now, after prison and rehabilitation in the Saudis' remarkable de-radicalization program, he serves enthusiastically as a living warning to others of the nature of the Al-Qaeda death cult. In Colombia, I met a young woman named Flor who had joined the FARC at age 12 because she was bored. She soon found that she had made a terrible mistake. living in an organization where babies are literally ripped from the wombs of pregnant women fighters. But she was trapped in the jungle for 7 years. The question that my colleague Jared Cohen of State and I asked after meeting with the leaders of the Million Voices movement in Bogota was this: are there other anti-violence, anti-extremist, anti-oppression organizations out there that are using online technologies to build movements? Could these young people both undermine the pernicious ideologies and find a productive outlet, a way to create positive identities through a global network that promotes peace and freedom rather than death and totalitarianism? We found 17 groups, for starters, organizing against violence and extremism in South Africa, the UK, India, Cuba, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Darfur, and Egypt, among others. And in partnership with such private sector institutions as Google, MTV, AT&T, Howcast.com, Access 360 Media, Columbia University, and Facebook itself, we are bringing them to New York for a summit starting on Wednesday, 2 days from now. These groups will be joined by about a dozen others that do not have an online presence but want one, from places like Indonesia, Iraq, and Venezuela.
Jim, you might mention the link for that event is on my blog.
And very happily, Steve has provided a link for that event on his blog, or you can, I think, just go to howcast.com, but you're better off going to Steve's blog, which is highly popular. The purpose of the summit is to share best practices, to produce a manual and an online hub, and create a giant global conversation about how young people can oppose violence and extremism. To return to Paul Berman, these young people subscribe to the ideal of the many, not the ideal of the one. This project is an example of how we see public diplomacy changing. We've arrived at the view that the best way to achieve our goals in public diplomacy is through a new approach to communicating, an approach that is made far easier because of the emergence of Web 2.0, or social networking technologies. And we call our new approach Public Diplomacy 2.0. PD 2.0 is an approach, it's not a technology, but new technology is absolutely necessary to its success. More than that, new technology gives the United States a significant comparative advantage over the terrorists. Now, that may sound counterintuitive. After all, during my Senate confirmation hearings back in January, I said, turning an inelegant phrase, that Al-Qaeda was eating our lunch on the internet. That is no longer true. Yes, Al-Qaeda and other violent extremist organizations have exploited the internet to their advantage, but that advantage has rapidly diminished, and not just